Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Paul Andebele. I serve as an Assistant Director in the Office of Research Excellence here in the Milken Institute School of Public Health. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Bioethics Interest Group here at the George Washington University, and also on behalf of our research ethics capacity strengthening programs in Mali, Pakistani, and also in Zimbabwe. I would also want to welcome you all on behalf of the Office of Research Excellence here at the School of Public Health. And by the way, I am actually in Accra, Ghana right now. So this is the advantage of technology. I don't have to be at GW, but I'm across Africa. So welcome to our webinar today, focusing on ethical issues in pharmacoeconomics and drug pricing. When you look at issues that relate to the rising costs of prescription drugs, we should all be worried because it actually means lots of people won't have access to affordable drugs. And when you look at issues that relate to the prices of drugs, we're actually looking at questions that relate to fairness, justice, and also, of course, access. So we need to ask ourselves how we can ensure that drugs are accessible to all those who need them. So to help us look into all these issues, we've got two excellent panelists. So let me take this time to thank them for making themselves available for this very, very interesting topic. So they are I'm going to introduce them now, and then later on, I'm going to hand over to them so that they can run the show. And our first panelist is going to be Professor Lou Garrison, who is Professor Emeritus in the Comparative Health Outcomes Policy and Economics Institute in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Washington, where he joined the faculty in 2004. He is also a visiting senior fellow at the Office of Health Economics in London, following his sabbatical there between 2012 and 2013. And he has actually worked for about 13 years of his career in the non-profit health policy sector, and actually worked as an economist in the pharmaceutical industry for 12 years. And he received his PhD in economics from Stanford University. His research interests include national and international health policy issues related to health technology assessments, personalized medicine, benefit risk analysis, and other topics that relate to pricing of pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and other technologies. Lou, welcome, and thank you for taking time to be with us. And our second panelist is Professor Julia Sleko, who is an associate professor in the Department of Practice, Science and Health Outcomes Research at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. And she's also the co-director of the Patient-Driven Values in Healthcare Evaluation Center and director of the Pharmaceutical Health Services Research Graduate Program. And her research interests include applied health economics, economic modeling, real-world health economics and outcomes research, and also patient-informed value assessments. And her PhD training actually focus on pharmaceutical outcomes research, particularly focusing on pharmacoeconomics. And right now, her areas of research are around assessing economic and comparative value of medications and healthcare decisions, amongst others. So thank you, Julia, for taking time to share with us on this very, very interesting topic. So after the presentation by our two panelists, we're going to go through our moderated question and answer session. Please feel free to put in your comments and also questions using the chat function and also the Q&A function. And after the Q&A segment, we're then going to have some brief closing remarks by our two panelists. So let me now hand over to Lou. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Paul. I need to get into the right slide here. All right. Do you see my first slide properly now? Okay, thank you so much. Let me begin with a thank you followed by a caveat and then an apology. As someone who was once a philosophy major for a brief period as an undergraduate, I thank BIG and GW Millikan for the opportunity to rethink about these issues and participate in this discussion. The growing inequality in wealth and in health that we've observed in the U.S. And the unequal access to medicines worldwide present economic and ethical challenges. In terms of a caveat or warning, please be clear that pharmacoeconomists do not set drug prices either in the U.S. or elsewhere. Health economists are only one contributor to the multidisciplinary collection of pharmacoepidemiologists, medical decision modelers, quality of life experts, and so on, who provide information to health sector decision makers. Our professional society, ISPOR, ISPOR, began 30 years ago and now has over 20,000 members in over 100 countries. I would recommend that if you want further information, you check there because we have lots of free information on good research practices. In terms of an apology, perhaps the best we can do in 30 minutes for our two presentations is to provide a general background, which I'll try to do, about what I call the market design of the pharmaceutical sector as part of a larger, what I call a global biopharmaceutical health innovation ecosystem. And my colleague Julia, who I had the pleasure of being with when she was a postdoc here at the University of Washington, is really working at the cutting edge of our efforts to characterize and measure health equity to support these decision makers. I shared a couple of versions of my presentation with the organizers, and a very long one, then a shorter one, and now this is the shortest one, but hopefully you'll get the flow of my thinking. I'm happy to provide slides if you'd like. What I want to do is, this is what I want to cover. I want to provide an introduction to the economic way of thinking, talk about medicines as economic goods, talk about market failures. The bias of economists is to try to make markets work, but we recognize failures and we make adjustments. I'll say a bit about value measurement, economic value from an economist's point of view, and then talk about the problem, the trade-off between rewarding innovation and improving access. Now, this is a picture of the Dean of American Health Economists, who I was good fortune to have as my dissertation advisor long ago, Victor Fuchs. He died 2 years ago. He wrote this book, which is still out there, that basically talks about the basic economic problem. We have scarce resources. Resources can be used in multiple ways, and people have different wants. So how do we allocate resources for that? Now, just in my lifetime, the population of the U.S. has gone from 150 million to over 340 now, I think. The population of the world has nearly tripled. And we've seen dramatic improvements in terms of global poverty, yet we see growing inequality in the U.S. And the graph at the right, you can see that the top 0.1% of the population is going back to about 25% of the wealth. I think 1% now has about half the wealth. So tremendous inequality of wealth, which affects inequalities in health. And we also have threats to science that I'm sure you're all aware of. This slide, I think, kind of captures some of the aspects that shows the life expectancy of men and women starting at age 40 by income level. And you can see the folks at the right with the very high income, the top percent, have a life expectancy of 85 to 90, whereas folks who have low incomes have a much shorter life expectancy of 75 to 80 years. Overall life expectancy is about 80 years. So this is conditional upon being 40. So, that's a great example of health inequality in our country. Now, well, when I was a TA in Victor's class, he asked a famous health economist shown here, Kenneth Arrow, to think about health economics for a while. And he wrote what is really the seminal article in our field in 1963 about uncertainty. And he, in addition to proving something called the impossibility theorem, which I would urge you to read about sometime, he did work on general equilibrium and what's called welfare economics. Economists' view is kind of utilitarian. We're trying to maximize the well-being of the population. Health is one aspect of that. Now, he also, the general equilibrium theory that he worked out mathematically basically said that markets work, they're efficient, economists' favorite word, that if everybody can make all the trades they can make, then we're all better off and then we can stop. And that's called Pareto optimality. But if you think that the income distribution and the corollary is if you think the income distribution or wealth distribution is not fair, then redistribute the income and wealth and then run the market again. It's messy when you try to then do in-kind transfers and other kinds of things, but we do those for good reason, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So just to give some context, I think people don't appreciate kind of what we spend on healthcare. You can see I've circled the average spending is about $15,000 per person per year. So if you think about that over a lifetime, that's almost $1 million budget that you have. Yet in any given year, half the people spend no money. And you can see here that the prescription drug spending, keep this in mind, is about, between 400 and 500 billion of the total health spending, which is about 5 trillion. So it's about 10%, 9 to 14, depending on the sector. Now, you've probably heard that we have the greatest percent of GDP spent on health, 17%. Other countries don't spend more than 12% for the most part. So we're very friendly to medical care and technology in general. Now, let me back up and ask, well, what is it from an economist's perspective? What is a medicine? We think about the system as having a health production function. We're trying to, but also happiness. Okay, not just health, but when you think about the health part of it, we have many inputs, hospital, physician care. The majority of spending is on those things, much more than medicines. But the social determinants of health probably do more to explain differences across countries than actual medical spending. But what is a medicine? Economists view it as information. It's an innovative medicine is new knowledge. And what's unique about that is my use of it doesn't necessarily prohibit others from using it, at least without from having the knowledge. So it's a public good. It's not a private good. When I use it, I don't use it up. And it's a global public good. So instead of just 340 million Americans, 8 billion people on Earth could benefit. Now, everyone has recognized for hundreds of years that free markets, as wonderful as they are, will not supply the appropriate level of public goods. So what do? We say we need to intervene. We set up intellectual property, for example, patents, and we subsidize production of the information, say for the NIH. And in the end, we still argue that what we need to do is finance this based on differential pricing so that the more well-off people who can place more value contribute more. And that's what I think, from my perspective, we're still trying to struggle with, and we fall far short of that, as you will see. But we do tiered pricing. We have different prices in different countries and different prices in different segments in the U.S. Okay, so what is pharmacoeconomics? It is a subset of health economics. What makes it a little unique is because so much of this is subject to regulation through the FDA or EMA in Europe. We have data on randomized trials. We don't have the similar data for all physician services or all hospital care. We do studies like that. We do trials, but this is a requirement. And so it really goes back to Arrow saying we have uncertainty, and we have uncertainty about product quality. So the reason virtually every country has a national regulatory agency is to certify the quality of the medicines. But it's very expensive to develop the information. So at launch, oftentimes we only have trials in 500 patients that everybody in the world can use. And we call that efficacy, the performance in the trial, but we care about how it's going to perform in the real world. And so what we do in our field is take that information on efficacy and project through models what we think would be good cost effectiveness. And then over time, we can gather more real world data and reevaluate cost effectiveness. Now, the other thing, most people probably don't realize that we only produce about 50 medicines a year. we spend somewhere between 300 billion and 400 billion on, or 600 billion on developing these medicines. So it's costing us billions per medicine up front on average, and we argue about that. But the point is, it's a big upfront payment, but 9 out of 10 drugs fail in the pipeline. So it's a bit of a lottery for the companies. The information becomes a global public good. Now, certainly there's an incentive to be a follow-on. If someone proves that something works, then other people come with a second product, and it may be better. Sometimes it wins. In the case of the statins for hypercholesterolemia, you may recall that Zocor was a great drug for a while, and then Lipitor came along, atorvastatin, and essentially took over the market. And from 1997, what is it, when it was approved, until 2011, it received a reward of 150 billion. So that's a giant reward compared to the average 3 billion that was invested up front. So we have big winners. Now, the other thing that's happened over the last 30 years is the science has progressed, and now we have drugs for rare and orphan conditions, cell and gene therapies, and so on. But a lot of these drugs are under accelerated approval because as patients, you want access. So there's that the regulator has to balance those considerations. Now, who finances this? Well, the short answer is the U.S. historically has provided the large share of financing. You can see in this comparison that the U.S. price is 3 times higher than the Canadian price. All these bars are relation to Canada. And then you can see that the diamonds indicate what the GDP per capita is. And there's other than the U.S., you see a little correlation, but very little correlation between the level and the actual price that are faced in these different countries. So that's a problem. There is a lot of free riding going on, it's called. Now, free riding is optimal. That's what the theory says. But the question is, people have an incentive to not reveal their true willingness to pay. And that's what a lot of the politics we hear about these days. Now, I think there are two big failures in this biopharmaceutical ecosystem. Number one is the delay from when this drug is launched in the US and other countries. You can see here the US on the left, it's a 4 month, and then for other countries, it then takes 2 years to launch and then 2 years to be reimbursed. So patients are waiting 4 years. It's even more, and these are in the OECD countries. It's even worse than that outside the US. In lower middle income countries, it's about 7 years. And these are for essential medicines in a recent study. And for low income countries, it's about 8 years. So tremendous delays. I would say that's a gigantic failure of the ecosystem. Now, an improminent exception was HIV therapy, where the global north finally came to their senses and said, we need to help the folks with HIV. And so the US government subsidized the purchase. And one thing we found out there is you could make a small molecule for 120 triple combination therapy for $125 per patient. And if you want to, so we had the PEPFAR program to subsidize that, because even South Africa had 40% of people with HIV. They could not afford it with their health budget, and there was a subsidy that happened, which is, as you know, has probably been reduced. Okay, so we struggle with what is value to an economist. I mean, value is a very broad term. You can think of it many ways. We're pretty pragmatic about saying the value of something is what you're willing to pay for it, and that's what we observe in every market. The trouble is, here we have health insurance, so none of us are actually paying at the point of service with our own money. We're paying from the plan's money, so we don't exactly observe it. We also know that values varies across people. Because of insurance, we can't measure it directly. Conceptually, what I would like to ask you is, when you're 20 years old, for example, well, suppose you would like a drug for your heart failure, over the rest of your life. How much would you be willing to pay per member per month or per year over the rest of your life? Well, in the US, we're already paying $15,000 per person, but that number is a very small number, and we can't ask that question. So instead, we've developed a methodology basically based on something called the quality adjusted life year, when we can discuss some of the limitations of that. And we use that. Now, I put that here in this. A few years ago, we did a reconsideration of value at our with the task force at ISPOR. And at 12 o'clock here, I'll talk about the time, is the quality adjusted life year. And again, it has some, it's potentially discriminating. But basically what it says is, well, everything else equal, if a medicine gives me more length of life, I'll pay more for it. If it gives me better quality of life, I'll pay for it. The question is, how do we combine that? But we do care about paying for it is at 1 o'clock. Well, what is the net cost impact? Does it save me hospital costs and so on? If it does, I'll pay more. Now, I think our field has come to the realization, I mean, we've known this for a long time, but we haven't put as much effort into measuring other things like the impact on productivity, the impact on family members. But going from 4 o'clock through 9 o'clock are elements related to uncertainty. And again, go back to Kenneth Arrow, uncertainty is the number one characteristic of this in this field. And, to me, this is really important. And I think the most important one that has been underappreciated is insurance value. And I like to point to, March of 2020 when I'm being told that there's a good chance I may die from COVID in the next few months. I can assure you that my happiness level was much lower at that point. And I was worried that we might not have a vaccine anytime soon, given those challenges. So my utility level fell. Then come September, the mRNA platform was validated. We had the COVID vaccines. My utility level is higher. And when you multiply that over 8 billion people, that's the peace of mind you get from knowing something can be done. So even if you never actually got COVID, you're better off. So it's extremely valuable. And so that, I think we're appreciating that. Now, at 10 o'clock is the bucket that I kind of have Julia in working on health equity. Now, we didn't do a lot about health equity, but since our task force report in 2018, a ton of work's been done, and Julia can tell you about that. Now, I would just want to say innovation is not easy to define. And at 11 o'clock, we have something called scientific spillover. So I could say, well, I'm an economist. If it gives me more life, saves me money, it's innovative. I don't really care how sexy the science is. But the science actually, like the mRNA platform, is a great example that could be used in different areas. So there's scientific externalities that are valuable. So if I'm just paying for qualities or just paying for peace of mind, I may not put enough money into R&D to get those scientific spillovers. So let me end with just saying, in addition to a trade-off between efficiency and equity, there's a trade-off here between innovation and access. So we basically we have 20-year patent lives for all things, but for medicines it takes 8 to 12 years to use up to get to market, given the regulatory things that we're worried about. So you have this limited market power for 8 to 12 years. And the system is you get to behave as a monopolist, and if we don't like it, we should tell you your request is unreasonable. We're not going to pay for it and push back. The other constraint is you have competitors, just like I mentioned, Lipitor coming in against Zocor, and the price can fall. Now, the point is this system of incentives provides more drugs in the long term, but it does result in higher prices. And what we need to do is have better differential pricing to deal with that. And that's something that I think people around the world are working on. Let me stop there and hand it over to Julia, and look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Okay, so Professor Garrison, great introduction to the topic, and I'll share my screen here. And while I'm doing so, would like to just give a big thanks to the Bioethics Interest Group at the Millikan Institute School of Public Health. Appreciate very much the invitation. So thank you for having me, Dr. Paul. Really nice to connect with you and get to know this group. And so as Dr. Garrison mentioned, we worked together when I was at University of Washington, so it's just a pleasure to be able to follow up on some of the topics that were mentioned in the first part of the presentation. So first of all, does my screen look okay? Lou, maybe you can tell me if it looks like
No, it looks great, Julia. Don't call me Dr. Garrison.
Well,
okay. Yeah.
Okay, so again, thank you for having me. I'm Julia Slako. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, and also our graduate program director of our Pharmaceutical Health Services Research Program. I'll follow up on a couple of the topics that were mentioned. And I also want to just echo the comment about the ISPOR, the resources available on the ISPOR, which is our Health Economics Society, on their website. Tons and tons of really great resources, both on the conduct of economic evaluation, but also background information on many of the things that have been mentioned already, and also I am going to talk about some topics related to health equity, and the work that their special interest group is doing is really excellent, and they have some really, really good resources there as well. And as well, that's really a forum to be able to interact with other people who have that research interest. So I can answer questions about that, but I'll get started. So the title of my talk is about public preferences for reducing health inequalities. Although I do want to tell you a little bit about some of the background of the work that we're doing in our center. So Dr. Paul mentioned the PAVE Center, Patient-Driven Values in Healthcare Evaluation, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. The premise of that is really following up on exactly what Lou mentioned is, over the past years, we've thought about kind of a broader view of value. What does value mean? How do we think about value? Can we measure value in ways that are new or different as compared to the way that we've done them in the past? And in fact, our Center for value assessment, we established here at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, with an award from the Pharma Foundation. And in fact, this center was established in response to the special task force, which came out with that value flower, that array of value elements that you saw on Lou's slides. So it was really in response to some of the ideas in that special task force that we established our center and wanted to think more about, how do we describe value? How do we understand from people what they value when they're making healthcare decisions? So a little bit about my project team for my equity project, which I will talk about in just a few slides. Just wanted to mention the project team here, as well as our collaborator and study sponsor from Genentech, Stacy Kowal. So just mentioning that affiliation. So a little bit of background on our center. When we established our center 5 years ago, one thing that was really important to us was to emphasize that we could elicit directly from people what are things that are important to them in their healthcare decision making. We think of those things as value elements. So what do people think about when they're making their choice for treatment, healthcare intervention, etc. So some of our foundational work at the center, which was published 5 years ago in this paper, presented a framework around what we found. So we used a bottom-up approach, meaning we started directly with patients and patient stakeholders to elicit from them through a series of guided iterative exercises what are the attributes that they think about when they're making decisions. So we organized those numerous attributes into the domains that are appearing here on your screen. Those different domains include treatment effects, access to treatment. So we've heard a little bit about that already today. Treatment costs, which of course I know is central to some of the topics that were the inspiration for this session today. But also life impacts and social impacts. So how does healthcare and different interventions and treatments impact the way people live and function? Those are things that people really care about a lot. So we wanted to understand more of those attributes. So we created this organizational framework to understand how those attributes are organized. And through some of the methodology that we have applied at our center, we can then test this framework among different clinical conditions. So the attributes were developed agnostic of any particular disease, but in some of the work that we've done, we've learned across different diseases where some of these attributes are more or less important. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then finally, the next step to that is really if we can quantify these data better and have reliable evidence on these attributes, that might be something that we could include in economic evaluation to the degree that those data are strong and acceptable to decision makers. So we also want to understand a bit from other decision makers whether some of these data are acceptable. And I'll mention a little bit of work on that as well. I'm just going to skip over this and tell you a little bit about some of our just really high-level findings with a couple of case studies. So when we're thinking about different conditions that people are living with, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or major depressive disorder, through this series of activities and prioritization exercises that we did with different groups of people, we understood a little bit more about which of the domains on that array of value elements were important to them. So you can see these are color coded. So the domains are by color, and then within those domains, there are different elements. So orange, treatment costs, the element that is important for both of these groups is affordability. And that's not really a surprise. That's something that that people care about. They care about their own ability to pay for their medication. But when we think about treatment effects, the domain of treatment effects, you can see that in these two conditions, the priorities there are quite different. In COPD, people living with that condition were concerned about side effects, how they would manage them, whether they were serious. In depressive disorder, people were concerned about the treatment effects being how long would it take? Would it relieve their symptoms? What were the different types of treatments they could have? And you can even see on the domain of life and life impacts, COPD, physical abilities were really important, whereas in depression, quality of work or someone's day-to-day activities, that was really what was important to them. So right away, we can see that it is important to ask people what they care about because you're going to find different things. The question then is, how do we put this information into decision making? And that is an area that's really central to a lot of the work that people are doing in our field, and something that you can all learn more about through an organization such as ISPOR or other research groups that are really committed to understanding things directly from people who are living with different conditions. So this just gives you a sense of when you ask people living with a condition what they care about, you are going to find different things. So we do have to acknowledge that one size fits all might not be reflective of patients' priorities when we're thinking about evaluation. So increasing the evidence and data to support these different elements is really important. The other part of it then is to understand, are some of those data elements acceptable to different decision makers and stakeholders? So I wanted to highlight some work that we just recently had published, actually last month, that was on the point of the study was to see if we could come to some consensus among a multi-stakeholder group about the importance and usability of data coming from patients. So we had a range of stakeholders who were included in the study, representing payers, value assessors, other researchers, and patients themselves and patient representatives, as well as some other groups such as manufacturers, weighing in on some different recommendations and guidance and coming to consensus around those. And we did find some really interesting things. In particular, we did find really strong support for engaging patients and caregivers in the value assessment and health technology assessment process. And we do see that value assessors and health technology assessors are including those voices along in their process. The other thing that we found is that there is strong support for including data coming directly from people living with conditions for value assessment. So that is an important finding. And of course, again, we need to make sure that those data are strong so that they are reliable and we can use them in our evaluations. So to give you a little bit of background on maybe some of the progress that's been made since the advent of that value flower, there's a lot of work going on in all of those different value elements. This just touches a little bit on some of the things that I've personally learned, but there's a whole group of researchers out there who are really working to extend the reliability of the evidence on those different novel or patient-centered value elements. Really very important area of research. So those are things that we can learn directly from, say, patients or people living with conditions. But what about the public? What does the public care about? Because that is also another topic that we think about is, what about when we're making decisions for a population, we can think about what does the public prefer, but that's a little bit different than people who are living with individual conditions. Public, you might think about taxpayers, people who are voting, and people who are enrolling in health insurance before they need to use it. So we also want to understand some things from the public, and that is going to lead into the work that I've recently done in public preferences for increasing equity or reducing health inequities. So the area of equity, of course, has been, a longstanding topic and concern in public health policy. And in recent years, we've had really, especially in the United States, I think, an increasing concern, and this is also in part due to the COVID pandemic, concern around unfair differences in health, the way people are able to access treatments and healthcare, their use of healthcare services, the geographic distribution of those healthcare services. And many of those concerns were really brought into the spotlight, I think, over the last 5 years. And as Lou mentioned, there's really been quite a lot of research in this area of equity, and specifically how it might apply to health technology development, and also health technology assessment. And there has been interest by value assessors and HTA bodies globally, as this is an area of importance. So, and this has come up over recent years in their guidance and their reports and so forth. Um, so we know that this is an area of interest, but again, we have to have methods and measures that can support the integration of those evaluations into our value assessments. So along with this increase of interest in improving equity in our system, there has also been quite a strong development of different methodologies and measures that can be used to support that. So again, could be a big topic, and there's a lot of resources available that I can point you in the direction of, but I'll give you just a bit of an overview of some of the things that we can do. So one way to think about the how we can start to really illustrate where there are inequities in our healthcare system is what we call the staircase of inequality. So this was something that was presented in a book that actually I'll show you on the next slide. And this is where we can use kind of a pathway to show that if we're thinking about health technology or a healthcare intervention or a medicine, we think about a population who needs the treatment, who receives the treatment, and what are their outcomes. And we can measure whether that is even across the population, or are there disparities on in the areas of who needs the intervention and who actually receives it, and what are their outcomes. And so we can measure some of those inequalities all across that spectrum. Now, as we heard, cost effectiveness analysis is really getting at maximizing total health. We think about cost per QALY. We've been introduced to that topic just in the last half an hour. And that's thinking about what do we get for what we spend. Distributional cost effectiveness is kind of a newer style of cost effectiveness, but it allows us to not only look at how we can maximize our total health, but also where is there balance or imbalance in some of the health outcomes across the population. So in fact, we can look at both where we're maximizing total health and where we're actually able to maximize equity or improve equity. But in order for that type of analysis to work, we need to understand, well, how much does a society actually care about improving equity? Do they care about it a little, or do they care about it a lot? Because if we are going to make decisions about allocating resources in a way that's different than maximizing total health, we need to make sure that that's something that our society actually cares about, the people who are making the decisions and the people who they're making decisions for. So that really is what led us to some of the research that we have recently done. I did want to highlight this book, which is all about distributional cost effectiveness analysis, and it goes through some really important and interesting case studies that are mainly focused in the United Kingdom, which is where a lot of this work has begun. And so we're really trying to translate this work into other areas, but they give some really great examples. For example, smoking cessation policies, we could think about whether those are cost effective on average over a whole population, but we might also think about, well, who are the groups of people who need smoking cessation? Does everybody need that equally, or are there groups who need that more? Do we know based on the data that there are people who are more likely to engage with smoking cessation and have positive outcomes from that, or are there disparities in access to smoking cessation and their outcomes? So this is where we can apply something like distributional cost effectiveness analysis, because we can look at whether those strategies are cost effective, yes or no, and then we can look at strategies as to whether they are helping to improve equity, or if they are kind of increasing inequalities across a population. So again, then to decide whether we want to adopt a strategy, so we can see that we have if we look at this graphic here on the left, strategies that are both cost effective and enhancing equity, that's a win-win. So it's easy to make that decision about adopting something like that, but something that might be either not cost effective and improving equity, or cost effective and harming equity, we need to make some judgment on that. And again, that's based on, well, how much does the society care about improving equity or not? And it turns out that we didn't really have a good sense of how much the US population cares about improving equity. That is a metric that you can elicit, and it's called health inequality aversion. So up until now, that's a measure that's been elicited from other populations, but not necessarily known well about our US population. So that is what we um, sought to do in our recent study. So health inequality aversion is really the concept that a person or a group of people might be willing to sacrifice health gains in either total health or in one group in order to improve benefits or improve health to another group. So we might think about this as Lou started out in the beginning of his talk. We see income inequalities, for example. That's one way to think about inequalities. We can think about health inequality related to income. We can think about health inequality related to other factors, and I'll show you how we did that in our study. But what we wanted to get at is, how much are people willing to trade off from groups who are better off in order to improve the health status of groups who are worse off to begin with? And how can we then apply that data in some of our decision making? So luckily, as I mentioned, this is a study that's been done in other places. In particular, this has been done in the United Kingdom, and they had an instrument that had been used about 10 years ago to identify inequality aversion in the English population. And so that was a survey instrument that we could adapt for our setting. So I'm not going to be able to tell you a lot of details on how we did that, but we do have a paper that's just forthcoming in Value and Health Regional Issues about the adaptation of our instrument. And our study findings were just published in the last month or so online. And you're welcome to read about what we found. But I will give you some high-level findings. And I see that I'm getting close on time here. So we'll get through this quickly. So we took about 2 years actually to complete this study. It was really quite a lengthy process. We had not only the survey with the trade-off exercise in it, but we had instructional videos and lots of other things that went along with it to help participants to be able to participate in the survey and complete it. So as I mentioned, we need to understand, we need to frame what are the inequalities that we are interested to characterize and elicit whether people are willing to make these trade-offs. So we framed inequalities in the US around the Social Vulnerability Index, which is an index that's from the CDC. And so we have data around the Social Vulnerability Index and how it applies to the US population in terms of characteristics of that population and also their life expectancy. So we use this graphic on the left to show survey participants what we're talking about when we mean better off and worse off groups. So the better off group in green, we described as the top 20% of the population in terms of these attributes of social vulnerability. So you can see there's income, education, other positive measures around that, and as well a higher quality adjusted life expectancy, which was about 10 years higher than what we called the worse off group, which is the bottom quintile of the social vulnerability index. So people living in those areas and had lower income, education, and other attributes, as well as a lower quality adjusted life expectancy. So we thought that this represented the highest and lowest on this this index, where we also had life expectancy data. So we chose to describe this as the better off and worse off groups. So then we asked participants to use this trade-off exercise to then tell us, over a series of 7 questions, how much would you be willing to trade off if you could allocate resources, or if the government could allocate resources for a program that would benefit the better off group and the worse off group in different ways? How would you make some of those trade-offs? So I won't have time to get into all of that, but over the course of 7 questions, we're able to characterize sort of a profile for each respondent, which then we can summarize at the level of our sample. So I'll highlight some of the findings. So we had about 1,300 respondents to this benefit trade-off exercise, and their responses are illustrated here in this plot. So, and each of these bands represents the proportion of respondents in each of these response styles. So to give you an idea of what this means, in the yellow band, which is over toward the left, that represents people, and it's a small proportion, about 2%, of people who are always going to choose the greatest total health gains. They're not interested in trading off anything. They always want to choose the program that has the greatest total health. To the left, over in the blue, these are individuals who are always going to trade off in order to give more gains to the better off group. And everybody over to the right of the yellow band, which you can see is the vast majority of the sample, is willing to trade off either total health or trade off gains to the better off group in order to close the gap between the two groups or to improve the health of the worse off group. So the way that we characterize that is that 88% of our respondents displayed some inequality aversion to some degree. So we were able to conclude from this that the majority of the respondents in our sample of about 1,300 were inequality averse to some degree, meaning that they were interested to trade off benefits from either total health or the worse or the better off group in order to improve the health of the worse off or to close that gap. I'll skip through a little bit of this because I know that I'm short on time, but we also asked respondents, well, which group did they think they were part of? And it was interesting to see that among our respondents, we actually found that about the same proportions that we showed them in the framing, we found back in that group of respondents. So about 20% said that they were in the better off group, and about 20% said that they were in the worse off group. And we didn't find a huge polarization in their own views on health inequalities, and aversion, I should say. So the better off group was slightly less inequality averse than the worse off group, but still a vast majority of all of those groups were inequality averse. So with these findings, these were important findings for us because we really feel that it does show support for more integration of health equity concerns in our evaluations here in the US. So I'll stop there. I know I've gone a bit over time, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for sharing with us some of the work that you are involved in that focuses on the other side of the equation. So you are focusing on the patients and their willingness to utilize the various innovations that out there. So thanks to the two of you for those great presentations. So now we're going to get into our Q&A segment. So let me encourage our participants to send in their comments and also questions using the chat or the Q&A functions. So let me go to some of the questions by our participants. And Lou, you actually mentioned the issue around the price differences between the global south and the global north. So the question is, what factors drive these disparities?
Well, I mean, I think the broad answer is it's just differences in ability to pay and income and wealth drive the differences. But I mean, the problem is we don't have a differential pricing scheme. And let me make one other comment. Julia talked about maximizing, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, the important for this is about ethics. And we have a major kind of not disagreement, but a different focus within our field on are we trying to maximize well-being, happiness, or are we trying to maximize health? And I would argue that the peace of mind you get from knowing that something can be done is not well measured in the way we do it. And that's really talking about happiness and well-being. And we call that the debate between welfarism and extra welfarism. And in the US, our system is very consumer oriented. Consumer sovereignty is the principle. Whereas in the UK, as a great counterpoint, they've made a decision that they want to have equality. They want to that they want to maximize. They're more focused on equal health outcomes. So they say we have a fixed budget, we allocate that centrally, and then we instruct our health service to try to maximize the health of the population using that. So that's a from an ethical point of view, that's a very different point of view. It has implications. And so for people who are interested in this issue around ethics of that, we have this debate between welfarism and extra welfarism, which is going on to this day. Now, as I said, it's a tremendous failure of the system, this global ecosystem, um, that we have, that the medicines after we invent them, they cost $100 to make, and yet the time to access in low income countries is for essential medicines is 9 years. Okay, compared. So it's you just can't. It's hard to justify that, but it is a failure of the system we've designed. Now, rich people in poor countries have access to medicines. They have so much. They're very rich. So, and oftentimes the companies don't have an incentive to launch their medicines in those countries. But poor people are poor not just on medicine; they're poor for food, for other parts of life. So that's the trade-off.
Thank you. Julia, any comments?
No, I think I'll just reiterate that it was interesting for us to find these results. Now, of course, it's a smaller sample, but to show that a very small proportion were interested in that, maximizing total health. Most people were interested in trading off to some degree. So I agree with Lou that this is a debate that's been ongoing, and and I think also, finding some of the work that I've seen that's more engaging individuals living with conditions, knowing that they care about a lot of things. Um, but we also have to make decisions for a whole group, and they may care about many different things across those conditions. So kind of what I've been thinking about is how do I sort of bring together what I've learned directly from patients and individuals, and then what do we see from the public, and how would that inform how we could make decisions here?
Yeah, thank you so much. And there is a question here that I think is currently topical. So there is a question which says, how can drug pricing be regulated for the common good while maintaining innovation incentives?
Okay, let me say that I'll go first, Julia, if you'd like. But I just want to remind you that economists believe that you can put a price on life. We believe we do it every day, that we make a choice. So we believe that, and that's part of it. And what we're trying to figure out is, I mean, for example, the U.S. government has a rule that a value of a life is $8 to $10 million when they're building a highway or something. And in our field, we talk about, well, what's the value of another year of life? And we ask, in the U.S., we argue about it. We don't have a fixed number, but that's an important number because we then use that number to reward for innovation, and that's the rule that we try to use, and especially in the UK, they use a different threshold. So a lot of the debate, is about that threshold, and I think I just want people to be aware of that. And so for me, the interesting question here, yes, I'm averse to inequality. Yes, we help the people, the PEPFAR program help people. There's not just a U.S. inequality. Most of us have some aversion to inequality of wealth and health. The question I'm dealing with in pharmacoeconomics is, okay, the companies that did the COVID vaccines uh, came up with vaccines that if I got ill, reduced my severity of illness. That was valuable. But they also got my grandchildren back to school. Now, how big a reward do I need to give them to do that? What should the reward be? And I think that's the part of pharmacoeconomics to me is most interesting. Yes, there are all these things that affect us, but the one lever we have in this things, we have the patent system, and how do we reward that innovation? And then how do we need to run a differential pricing scheme, and there's some of that is done, but it's inadequate given the delays we see.
Thank you. Julia, any thoughts?
Yeah, Dr. Paul, maybe could you remind me of what the question? Sorry, God.
The question was about the regulation of drug pricing
Right.
for the common good whilst maintaining incentives for innovation.
Right. Yes. No, I got was interested in Lou's response around this idea around bringing a reward for bringing being able to bring students back to school, having a vaccine or treatments available. And I think yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I can't really speak to what that reward should be, but I think, the one thing that sort of influences my point of view is that I worked in pharmaceutical industry for quite a while before I went to graduate school. And that's actually why I wanted to study pharmacoeconomics, because I worked in a company where they spent a long time trying to discover a drug. Lots of people were employed for many, many years. Did a lot of work to really, just about get one thing going after, a decade of research. So kind of seeing that firsthand, I think, has informed a little bit of the way that I think about that. Not necessarily that I have an answer, but yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. We've run out of time, so I'm going to allow 30 seconds to each of you to give some parting shots. I'll start with Lou, 30 seconds.
I think I just gave you my thoughts. Okay. No, again, the two big problems we face, in my view, is in what I call the global biopharmaceutical health innovation ecosystem. And I deliberately use the word ecosystem because if you study complexity theory, you realize it's very hard to predict what's going on. And yes, we've come up with patches. We have the patent system. We have drug regulation, but we're falling short in getting access from a global perspective. And not only that, there's no strong incentive in the system to generate real world data for patients. So that's a big movement in our field. A lot of people are focusing on real world data. Now, the big question for me is, as a result of that ecosystem, we're producing 50 medicines a year. There's still a lot of unmet need out there in the world of new diseases, that especially in low income countries. So, do we have the optimal amount of spending on medicines? Should we watch more football and go to more musicals and so on, or should we spend more on health? Okay, that's our choice, and what we're doing. Anyway. So I would just point out the pharmaceutical industry, as this incentive is we let them be a monopolist for a while, and then we resent them being a monopolist. Okay, you shouldn't be surprised that they behave that way, and we have to constrain that behavior if we don't like it. But I will say that of the 1% of people who own 50% of the wealth in America, they're not, most of them were not employees in the pharmaceutical industry. The people I worked were like Julia. They were biostatisticians, epidemiologists, working on products that failed nine out of 10 times, but they were trying to do good for people. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Julia, your parting shots, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I've seen and learned is by engaging people who are the ones making the decisions, whether that be the patients themselves or people living with conditions or the public, really gives us a lot of insights, things that will inform the way that we can make decisions better for our society, whether that be here or elsewhere, but also really emphasizes that we need reliable data that go along with that, so that those will be data that are trusted by decision makers. So, we have the ideas that are coming from things that we elicit from people, the importance of things, what they value, but we also need good measures of that too, to reflect that the right way in our evaluation, so that can all translate into decision making.
Thank you very much. So let me now take this opportunity to thank our two panelists, Julia and Lou, for taking time to be with us and to talk to us about this very, very interesting topic. I could see there were lots of interesting questions, and many of those questions were actually coming from our doctoral students. I could see that. So thank you so much, and thanks, Lou. I saw you actually providing some responses to some of those questions. Let me also take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining this session today. This session qualifies for professional enhancement hours. So for our students within GW, please feel free to send your PE forms through our email address. I think it has been sent through the chat function. Please send that your form so that you can receive some signatures. So once again, thanks to our two panelists and thanks to everyone for joining today. And from me in Ghana, Accra, goodbye.
Good night. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Paul.
you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.